Dr. Kluge.
We're going to be at this climate change thing for a number of years in the future, and we feel that the organization itself, that is institutional adaptation, is an element that we need to focus on. In some ways, for the authorities and the mission that we have, just as all agencies and organizations have, it may be the most basic adaptation that we need to develop first, because if you're not adapting as an organization in many forms, you can't handle the rate and the nature of the changes that we are going to be going through in the future. We are just kind of at the elbow of the hockey stick, so to speak, in so many different areas that the whole management scheme, the management reward system, the way we go about things are likely to be changing in the future, and we need to get ahead of that. Let's look at our backyard, your backyard, at least domestically in the U.S. The forests cover about 750 million acres. I guess that's 330 or something hectares, million hectares, a bunch. About 33% of the land cover in the U.S. And as we look at the impacts assessments that have been done through IPCC, USGCRP, and others, we see different scenarios play out for different parts, different nations of the nation's forests. So that the impacts of climate change are going to be quite a bit different in the east than they are in the interior west than they are in Alaska. So in developing a climate change integration to our programs, we have to take into account geographic diversity and how climate change plays out differently in different parts of the country. And the Forest Service itself is a very decentralized organization, so we have to develop a program that develops a balance, that maintains a balance between centralized direction and decentralized response to those unique manifestations of a changing climate. Okay, the U.S. Forest Service of the nation's forest and grassland resources for the benefit of present and future generations. We had this mission before climate change, or the knowledge of climate change, or perception, or awareness came along, but now we got big time change in context. So how do we pursue that same mission for that big swath of green infrastructure that really is part of providing the kinds of services that you see there? And so we see our business and the taxpayers' business as one of providing a portfolio or a range of ecosystem services, whether there are markets for ecosystem services or not, and as those markets develop, of course, that will change the policy fabric, but we still are in the business of providing ecosystem services. About a fifth of the water supply in the U.S. comes from the watersheds on national forest land, big chunk. Up there, way in the headwaters in very strategic locations. U.S. forests offset about, and this is private and public forest, offset about 12% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. So this big chunk of forest land, there's about 41 billion metric tons sitting out there, kind of on the hoof or on the stump or whatever you want to call it for a forest, sequester, I think, 780 million tons a year. So there's a carbon sequestration service to the forest that's it's been there for a long time. It's now coming into the awareness of forest managers, especially public forest managers, and weaving carbon management into the management for other ecosystem resources is a more complex task than it might seem, because you're trying to move a large 35,000 person organization that stretches from Puerto Rico to Hawaii to Alaska. It's more serious and more intense than it has been in the past. The same way with fires. We have about 6 million acres a year that burn. Up until the mid-'80s, that was only 3 and 4 million acres. So we've had quite large upturns in disturbance patterns and in the impacts on the snowmelt and impacts on the snowpack and early melting of the snowpack that leads to longer fire and insect and disease seasons. And the inventory and analysis program has plots across the U.S., approximately every 3 miles, so about 5 million plots across the U.S. that it remeasures every 5 years, and re-updates actually every year, requires a portion of those are remeasured. We're actually starting to see species migrate. Sugar maple, for example, in the lower portion of its range, we find fewer and fewer, smaller and smaller regeneration component as it actually moves forward. And the centroid of that sugar maple and other eastern species are starting to move north. So we're actually beginning to get lots of indications that, yeah, this climate change thing, or whatever you want to call it, is real. And to ignore it as managers is really a dereliction of our duty and our mission. So we have to respond to it if you're so inclined not to believe it. These are facts that we're finding on the ground. So it's really all about adaptation using the best available science. This is quite an interesting, if you thought the tech transfer cycle was critical in the past, try now, if we ever thought that technology transfer, moving science through the science process, the ideation process, on into the development process, the deployment of the development of those tools that were developed, and the actual adoption, if we thought that was viscous in the past, we can't afford to be that slow in the future.